My name is Charlie Fenton and I'm a PhD student at the University of Kent, researching the impact of the Reformation in Kent during the reigns of Edward VI, Mary I and Elizabeth I. I run a blog and Facebook page through the eyes of Anne Boleyn and have recently released a book on Jane Parker, Anne Boleyn's sister-in-law. Today I'll be showing you a manuscript I'm currently studying from Elizabeth's reign, specifically 1570, which shows the impact of iconoclasm on Elizabethan churches. This document concerns St Stephen's Church in the parish of Hackington, which is part of Canterbury now and is just over a mile away from the cathedral. The original St Stephen's Church was built around 1100 and was traditional residence of the Archdeacon of Canterbury until the Reformation, when it was taken over by King Henry VIII. The church did well with its proximity to Canterbury Cathedral, a centre of pilgrimage, but struggled with the impact of the Reformation and the changes imposed upon it. Looking at this manuscript, we can see that, just at first glance, it's a relatively important church case. We can see 3 seals attached here, 2 of which are those of the most important people in the area, Matthew Parker, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Edmund Guest, the Bishop of Rochester and Archdeacon of Canterbury. The 3rd seal is that of Richard Coste, the vicar of St Stephen's, as is his church. The seals are incomplete, but the 3 are still interesting to see together. One of the most recognisable seals is that belonging to Matthew Parker. This only shows part of what would have been the saviour. Sitting on the world at the bottom here. We can also just see the edges of wings on both sides, which would have been angels blowing trumpets, going by the other seals of his we have from the time. Then there is the seal of Edmund Guest, who had been Archdeacon of Canterbury since 1559 and Bishop of Rochester since 1560. He was here in the capacity of Archdeacon, as the Archdeacon, as mentioned earlier, was traditionally to reside in the parish. The last one is that of Richard Coste, who, unlike the other 2, was the newest member of the church there. This was his first post and he had been vicar of St Stephen's since 1568, so he'd only been there around 2 years at the time of this agreement. It is part of a chirograph, hence the wavy lines at the top of the document. As each person would have kept a copy of it, which then could be put back together, sort of like a puzzle, and to confirm its authenticity. So there likely would have been 3, 1 for each who put a seal to it. It is in Latin, the traditional language for documents such as these, and decrees that the church should be compensated for the loss of oblations, formerly made to the image of St Stephen. It also says that the vicar, Richard Coste, should have the tithes of hay and corn within the parish boundaries. He should then pay out of these an annual pension of £8 to the Archdeacon of Canterbury, which is now Edmund Guest, one of those who signed and put his seal to this. £8 would be worth around roughly £1,900 today. It is also an augmentation, which is the name of a court first erected by Henry VIII a few decades before. This was for determining suits such as these concerning abbey lands and monasteries. It is mentioned several times throughout and is referring to increasing the revenue of the vicarage of Hackington. The impact of iconoclasm, the destruction of images, on churches is evident here, to the point where several members of the church have agreed that some compensation should be made for it. St Stephen's is, like many churches, named after a saint, and it is clear that offerings made to that image must have been substantial and, as such, the loss of that would have been great. The image would have been suppressed over 20 years previously, so it's interesting that it's still being discussed now. The fact that loss was great enough to require financial aid shows that the local people really did value this saint and must have given regularly to it. This money was not then directed to the church itself, when the image was suppressed, and thus it lost an important source of revenue. One man who would do much for the area and the church itself was Roger Manwood. Manwood was gifted the manor and Great House, formerly the Archdeacon's residence, by Elizabeth I. He is buried in the church itself and built 7 almshouses near it in 1570, the same year as this document, as well as spending a considerable amount on its restoration. But before then it was struggling and was at one point described as being in a ruinous state, which wouldn't have been helped by the loss of offerings to their saint. This would still be an issue even after this, with it being brought up again in 1588. Archbishop Whitgift recorded that the revenues of it were, in former times, more large and copious by reason of certain superstitious offerings before the image of St. Stephen in that parish church, which were now ceased by the good laws and benefit of the preaching of the word. It was even described as being impoverished at this time, so sadly the compensation Parker agreed to obviously did not have much impact. So this is just the start of a long issue, but it's fascinating to see the early impact of iconoclasm on an individual church. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed my brief talk on this manuscript and the impact the suppression of images had on St. Stephen's Church. It is difficult to generalise, but other churches would have suffered under these changes too, and it raises some questions as to how they negated the impact of this loss of revenue.